Rogue decks, the little guy, the underdogs of Yu-Gi-Oh! Historically very weak to a single staple card printed 7 years ago. Hey, she can even legally play the game now.
Actually, Ash Blossom is a 4,000-year-old zombie spirit from...
The worst part here is that these decks usually end up losing to themselves, let alone a light fart breezing nearby. But something I feel has changed with rogue decks in the last few years. Rogue decks somehow feel worse than they ever have. Now there's a lot to cover today, so let's see how we're gonna divide up this discussion. A lot of what I'm going to say here applies quite transferably over to other card games. Now, while primarily a Yu-Gi-Oh video, there is most definitely a lot to take away from this in the general understanding of meta and non-meta gaming discourse. Topic number one, let's actually define what the term rogue means here, because this term has probably about 4 legitimate interpretations depending on who you ask and at what time of day and mood they're in. Topic number two, once we've outlined some of the definitions of rogue, we should look at some of the reasons, benefits, and advantages to be gained by playing a rogue deck. And number three, why is rogue actually rogue, and why playing these decks is such an uphill battle other than the obvious. Finally, number four, let's talk about some of the solutions to this problem. Now, if you want a full definition of what rogue means, I'd highly recommend you check out my tier list video where I go through the 7 different layers of definitions of ranking the quality and powers of archetypes. Now, like I said at the start, the term rogue is somewhat of an explosive term in Yu-Gi-Oh! Now, what I want to do is look at decks that are maybe only about as capped as their regional performances at best. Labyrinth, for example, is better than a rogue deck right now because it has maybe 1 or 2 tops per event. It's best to avoid decks that have had premier success recently, like Pearly, Branded, Flunder, although technically I would classify even Flunder as a rogue deck by now. Point here is that I don't want you to get too fixated on the actual definitions here because it's a whole discussion in and of itself, and it's actually not that important to some of the topics here. But for the rest of this video, when I am saying rogue, let's talk about the extremely rare strategies that basically have no major tier 2 plus event success. We're looking at decks like Earth Machine, Dragon Maid, Gold Pride,
Modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Rescue Hamster Turbo.
You know, stuff like that. Topic number 2, let's cover why even play rogue in the first place. I think that people play rogue decks for about 2.5-ish reasons. In no particular order, a significant reason to play rogue is because people love to be unique special snowflakes just like everyone else. And I don't say that in a negative way. That is genuinely a good feeling to feel like you are something special that you are doing by yourself. For years, one of the biggest complaints on social media, constantly format to format, meta to meta, is you only won because you played X deck or you're copying pros. And now, while I would not go as far as to say they're right, as someone who has a pet deck and does enjoy trying to see how well and far I can go using a not so popular strategy, there is absolutely something cathartic and enjoyable about coming up with a deck all by yourself. Creating new combos, new synergies, and discovering brand new tech cards all alone is a massively rewarding experience. In 2022, for example, I invented Sword Soul and piloted it all the way to the top 16 of the UK National Championship. Nobody thought to play Moe and generic staple cards until I did. Truly incredible. But that goes without saying, don't shit on people who do choose to play meta. Emulating other people's success to get the best possible result for yourself is really just a legitimate way to play the game, and it's something that people use outside of just strategy card games. A second important reason that I think people are relegated to playing rogue is naturally budget. Yu-Gi-Oh! Is an especially expensive game, and unlike Master Duel, where you can essentially craft the best decks for free, format to format, as long as you keep up with the game regularly, you'll be fine. Or comparatively to the TCG, other games like Pokemon can essentially have full meta decks for like dirt cheap. At least compared to Yu-Gi-Oh! Today, we can look at Tenpai as a meta deck that you can get for around 150 or so. You can go further than that and actually buy Pearly, which is a decent tier 1 or 2 deck for about 40 bucks. The problem here, however, is that Yu-Gi-Oh! Can start to become hella expensive once you start optimizing. Now, the irony with this is that some rogue decks can even be way more expensive than the meta decks. Now, while some main deck pieces like all of your virtual world cards could be cheap, fully optimizing with things like a playset of Prosperity, for example, before the reprint, or SP Little Knight as an example today, that shit will absolutely eat in hard for your deck building budget. And so if a budget is the reason you play rogue, there's arguably less reason to play some rogue decks than meta decks like Tenpai, for example, because a fully optimized Pendulum deck will probably cost you more than Tenpai just because of the staples alone.
Let's go!
Now, obviously, that's not to say some rogue budget decks don't exist. You can absolutely have both of those together. I'm just trying to highlight some of the further problems enhanced by the definition of rogue once you start factoring in the min-maxing. A third overlooked factor is a bit of a surprise factor. Now, while showing up with something like Abyss Actor is Well, it's definitely surprising. Surprisingly shit, nonetheless. It is surprising. Now, not to bully that community of 4 people too much, but what do we mean by surprising? If you're dueling against your opponent at a high-level tournament, the chances are that they know most of the Snake Eye lines. They know where to imperm, I mean, usually just the first thing possible, the neat plays involving Diabellstar, the Zolantis OTK to watch out for. They know what's up. But if you're playing a rogue deck, chances are they might not know where the choke points are in Earth Machine. I've personally watched peeps play that stupid shit about 100 times. Just hit the normal summon. Better have it. But that's the thing. If your opponent only has maybe 1 disruption and they just immediately throw it at your first card that you're essentially trying to bait them with, you can probably get a little bit of an edge against them. The number of times I've had people Ash Tour Guide and Scarm instead of Graph, for example, has won me a decent amount of games, and not enough to make Burning Abyss a real threat, but some. Chapter 3, potentially the most important one here. Let's talk about why playing Rogue is an uphill battle in and of itself. Some of these points might be fairly obvious, but I think trying to eloquently put these into a thoughtful framework might be helpful in establishing some of the reasoning for those of you that might not have thought of this word for word. Reason number 1 here is going to be quite obvious. Rogue decks are weaker than meta decks. But that isn't to say that a weaker deck cannot find an advantage against a more powerful deck. I always like to bring up the example of zombies as a weak deck, but if you so happen to be in a meta of tribute summoning, very unlikely that'll ever happen again, or a meta where your opponent's typing can become very relevant, engine access to something like Zombie World might potentially put this deck hypothetically as a solid anti-meta threat. So despite being weaker, there are still advantages to be gained. Yeah, like sometimes they can just be floodgates, but other examples can include, for example, Infernoid. A graveyard-heavy meta could see something like Infernoid being a deck that can just take advantage of the fact that they have quick play DD Crows as part of their entire engine. Now, I say Infernoid here, but they've just had their new support announced, but I'm talking about support. And we did see this happen, for example, at a 2019 YCS, back when Infernoid was not on anyone's radar. Now, reason number 2 why meta decks are better than rogue decks, other than the obvious fact that they're just stronger, is resources. If more players play meta deck Goku Balls Control, then the archetype Goku's Balls Control will have Facebook groups, active Discord communities, a general presence of mind surrounding all of Goku's Balls techs, choices, strategies, and naturally learning all of the ins and outs as well as finding these tech cards. Side patterns will be plentiful compared to rogue decks because it's simply less popular, therefore less allocation of resources towards it by the community. I don't know why Goku's Balls was the first thing that I thought of. I tried to think of, I could have just used any archetype name. Why didn't I just say Lightsworn or something? Now, trust me, I've looked into this. Not Goku's Balls, but I've looked into generic rogue decks. There is a hugely active, thriving Infernity and Dragoonity community, for example, constantly talking about new cards, support, with full labeled out step-by-step spreadsheets and combo guides. But the thing is, there is this many resources available for the meta decks, usually by better players and easily accessible. And the third reason here is the player quality. This has always been one of the most annoying, well, actually takes I've read online for years. Bro, you have to trust me, bro. Fire Fist is a good deck right now. The problem is that nobody actually knows how to play it. Now, while I personally almost decided to become a Fire Fist one trick after watching Fire Fist Ace in One Piece, I mean, I don't know why he's not the main character. One Piece mentioned, over time, I think I've actually warmed up to this argument a lot. Right now, for example, DDD could be a good deck. Maybe not right now because we're in a tier 0 meta, but you get what I'm saying. But the thing is, there just aren't any great minds playing DDD, Infernity, Dragoonity, etc, etc. If all of the best players in the world right now are mastering, practicing, and basically just doing everything and anything related to Snake Eye, then the gap between the rogue and meta widens even further. But now you also have better players playing meta decks and worse quality players playing rogue decks, because naturally the better competitive players will gravitate towards the strongest deck. So now when you have a bunch of decks that are maybe just this far apart, they now actually end up having a bit more of a gap between them. And because of the quality of those players all playing those decks, the resources are going to just be inherently better and higher quality than the resources of the average player for the rogue decks. And therefore the gap widens even further. It is actually quite fascinating when you articulate this into a real framework of understanding of why this exists and how it happens. Because the reality, the difference in power between a rogue deck and a meta deck played perfectly and optimized well, deck building wise, etc, may only be, for example, a 15% number. Let's just throw an arbitrary number out there, but that gap can maybe extend all the way up to like 40-50%. So the gap is widening for reasons other than just the deck is worse or better. And I really find that to be such an interesting thing when you really think about it and label it, and it's why I really wanted to make this video, is to really highlight this main key point. So part number 4 here, solutions. I think I have a major perspective to offer at the rogue spot. Ever since COVID, the power of cards has felt like it's been spiking quite a lot. Power of the Elements being one of the biggest and most powerful sets ever. Meta decks are getting more and more powerful, while the rogue decks being printed alongside them, like for example, I don't know, Valmonica, they just really can't keep up. I think most rogue players accept that their decks are just fundamentally worse and suck by comparison to the top tier decks. But I think that a major problem that's occurred in the last few years is that that gap that I'm talking about feels to be widening outside of just, you know, the player quality and resources. If you go first with a rogue deck, uninterrupted, do your full combo, maybe you could have won 50% of the time or something. Nowadays, however, it feels like rogue decks are maybe scraping like a 20% win rate. And I think that rogue players probably just want to feel like if they deck build well and optimize and generally just play better than their opponent who is on a meta deck, it would be nice to feel rewarded for that by winning most games, or at least some of the games. The problem, at least right now, and again, I try to keep these topics quite general and timeless, regardless and irrespective of format, but just as a current format example, someone just completely stumbling their way through Snake Eye can probably beat 90% of non-Snake Eye decks. And again, it's about how, like, that gap is so monumentally huge, not just because of the resources or the player quality, but the actual power of deck A versus deck B, just in general in recent years, has felt like it's been widening. But conversely, when looking at it from the other perspective, maybe that just isn't a problem. Maybe you just need to accept the fact that Altergeist is done. Play the new Altergeist deck. It's called Labyrinth. I mean, that's unironically what, for example, DZEV has been doing for the past couple of years. Some of you might be able to just take a playstyle you really like and then upgrade it into the new reskin of whatever playstyle that deck is with a new archetype. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you really like my content, want more discussion breakdowns like this, make sure you leave a comment down below telling me what you'd like to hear from. And if you're really enjoying the content, consider supporting me on Patreon or watching me live on twitch.tv/Farfa. Hit that subscribe button, bell notification, and until next time, adios!